Breaking today, an investigation into Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's revolting hospital stunt where young children suffering from terminal cancer in some cases were used as props, were put at health risk in order to kick off this fake royal tour.
Well, I do think that Sussex Overdrive is unbelievable. But I mean, I don't think that he is going to get back in. I mean, I think that there are two reasons. One is I think that William wouldn't allow it.
Everything is about a stunt, and it doesn't matter who you use. It doesn't matter what morality you trample all over, given that at other parts of the tour, of course, these people have been saying, well, no children should be on social media, yet they will use sick kids in such a despicable manner.
The Duchess of Duplicity is out of control. She spoke out earlier today in Australia, where she was attending a youth mental health organization conference.
There was a moment, barely a few seconds long, that changed the entire perception of this tour, and most people missed it the first time they watched. A hospital corridor, cameras already positioned, vulnerable children brought forward, and before anything even began, a quiet instruction slipped out, "Let's make this quick." And suddenly what looked like compassion started to feel like something else entirely. What you are watching unfold in Australia is not just another public appearance, and it is definitely not the triumphant return that some headlines tried to sell in the early hours of this tour.
Now, the tour got no better as the week continued, with Meghan Markle's fake tears on Bondi Beach, booze at an Australian rugby game, but I think it was the hospital itself.
What you are actually witnessing is a carefully constructed sequence of moments designed to rebuild an image that has been steadily eroding for years. Except this time something is different, because the cracks are no longer subtle and the audience is no longer passive. People are noticing details, people are questioning intent, and more importantly, people are comparing what they are seeing now with what royal duty is supposed to look like when it is done properly. At the center of this growing unease is one specific visit that has triggered a level of backlash that even seasoned royal observers did not expect to escalate this quickly. The Royal Children's Hospital appearance was supposed to be the emotional anchor of the tour, the kind of moment that generates sympathy, headlines, and shareable clips across every platform. Instead, it has become the single most damaging sequence of the entire trip, because once you strip away the surface optics, what remains raises uncomfortable questions that are very difficult to ignore. Think about the setup for a second, because the setup is where everything starts to feel off. These are immunocompromised children, some of whom are dealing with life-threatening conditions, children whose environments are normally controlled with extreme caution, where even family visits are managed carefully to reduce exposure to infection. Yet on this occasion, they were brought out into a more public space, placed in front of cameras, and introduced to visitors who had just arrived from a long international flight, carrying with them all the unknown variables that come with that kind of travel. When you slow that moment down and examine it step by step, it becomes increasingly difficult to justify the decision-making behind it.
And then when news of your terrible behavior got out, the press turned on you. Stop going to groups of children. Days ago, it was kids in a cancer hospital. Now it's kids dealing with anxiety and depression, and making it about yourself, your image rehab, or your need for publicity.
And this is exactly where the narrative begins to shift from sympathy to scrutiny, because audiences are no longer reacting to what they are told to feel, they are reacting to what they are actually seeing. The expressions on the children's faces, the staging of the visible presence of media teams, all of it contributes to a perception that this was not simply a quiet, compassionate visit, but something far more orchestrated. Once that perception takes hold, it becomes incredibly hard to reverse, because every additional detail starts reinforcing the same conclusion. What makes this even more powerful is the comparison that people are instinctively making, not because they are being told to, but because the contrast is impossible to ignore. When royal visits to hospitals have been done in the past, particularly by figures who understood the weight of those environments, the approach was almost always private, controlled, and focused entirely on the patient rather than the image. Cameras were often excluded, moments were kept personal, and the priority was dignity rather than visibility. That difference in approach is now being replayed in people's minds as they watch what is happening in Australia, and the gap between those two styles is where much of the criticism is coming from. But the hospital visit is only the surface layer of a much larger story, and if you stay with this long enough, you start to realize that this tour is not operating in isolation. It is happening at a very specific moment, and that timing is not accidental. behind the scenes, there are pressures building that have nothing to do with public appearances and everything to do with reputation, credibility, and control. The Australian tour is functioning as a distraction, a way to dominate headlines with imagery while far more serious developments quietly gain momentum elsewhere. This is where the analysis from people who have followed this story closely becomes impossible to ignore, because when someone who has spent years documenting patterns begins to describe the current situation in blunt, almost dismissive terms, it forces you to reconsider what you are actually watching. The word being used to describe this tour is not glamorous, it is not dramatic, and it is certainly not flattering. It is a word that suggests something smaller, something less impressive than it is trying to appear, and once you hear it, it becomes very difficult to unsee the behavior through that lens. At the same time, there is another layer to this that adds a level of tension most casual viewers are not yet fully aware of. Public perception is shifting, but so is institutional patience, and those two forces do not always move at the same speed. While audiences are reacting in real time, forming opinions based on what they see in front of them, there are parallel processes unfolding that operate on a completely different timeline, processes that involve legal scrutiny, documented evidence, and decisions that carry consequences far beyond a single tour. And this is exactly why the stakes feel higher than they initially appear, because what is happening in Australia is not just about optics, it is about credibility under pressure. Every appearance, every interaction, every small detail is being viewed through a more critical lens than ever before. And when that level of attention meets a situation that already contains underlying tensions, the outcome is rarely controlled by the people trying to shape the narrative. If you pay close attention to how this tour is being received, especially by audiences who were once more neutral or even supportive, you begin to notice a subtle but important shift. The enthusiasm is not the same, the reactions are more measured, and in many cases, the benefit of the doubt is no longer being given as freely as it once was. That change does not happen overnight, and it certainly does not happen without a reason, which means what you are seeing right now is the result of a longer trajectory rather than a single misstep. And yet, this is only the beginning of the story, because the real question is not just why this tour feels different, but what it is trying to achieve before something much bigger takes center stage. If the hospital moment made people uncomfortable, what comes next is where that discomfort starts turning into something sharper, because once you begin questioning intent, every other detail suddenly matters more than it used to. And here is the question that quietly sits underneath everything you are seeing right now. Why this tour, and more importantly, why now? Because timing in stories like this is rarely random. When a public campaign suddenly intensifies, when appearances are scheduled back-to-back, when visibility becomes the priority, it is usually because something else is happening at the same time that cannot be controlled as easily. And in this case, there is something unfolding in the background that carries far more weight than a tour, far more risk than a headline, and far more consequences than a few uncomfortable photographs. Now think about this carefully, because this is where the story begins to shift direction. A legal case, filed quietly, not immediately public, but serious enough that when it finally surfaced, it changed how many observers started interpreting everything else. A defamation lawsuit, connected not to an external critic or a tabloid headline, but to an organization that was supposed to represent something very different, something charitable, something protected from this kind of conflict. Ask yourself this, because it is the question many people are now asking behind the scenes.
I think personally, they've separated their professional lives, but I think what's really a great problem for them now, as of in the last few weeks, is that Meghan has got no real income anymore. She's finished.
Right.
The Netflix series is over. There's no great podcast. They don't generate any money. And I don't see where she is going from here. I think she has a major problem.
How does a situation reach a point where a charity, something built to help vulnerable communities, ends up taking legal action against one of its own most visible figures? That is not a small disagreement. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a breakdown at a level that suggests deeper issues, deeper patterns, and decisions that have consequences far beyond public image. And this is where the details start becoming harder to ignore, because according to the claims that are now part of this case, the conflict was not sudden. It was not emotional or impulsive. It was built over time, involving communication, disagreements, and ultimately accusations that point toward something far more strategic. Allegations of coordinated actions, allegations of reputational harm, allegations that suggest the situation was not just personal, but operational. Now pause for a moment and think about how that connects back to what you are seeing in Australia. Because if a legal battle of this scale is building quietly in the background, then the sudden need for positive exposure, the emphasis on public appearances, the push for controlled narratives, all of it begins to make a different kind of sense. It no longer feels like a simple tour, it starts to feel like a response. And here is where the tension increases even further, because at the center of this legal conflict is a figure who is not easily dismissed, not easily pressured, and certainly not someone who appears willing to step back quietly. Someone described as analytical, strategic, and methodical, which means this is not a situation that will fade away with time or be softened through public perception. This is a situation that is likely to escalate, because it is being handled by someone who understands exactly what they are doing. So now the question becomes more direct.
Every public figure has been subjected to negative scrutiny, often very intense and unpleasant. You had the benefit of universally loving and adoring, praise, fawning press for a year.
What happens when public image and legal reality start moving in opposite directions? Because that is where things become difficult to manage. You can shape a narrative for a few days, you can influence headlines for a short period, but legal processes operate on evidence, on documentation, on consistency. And if there is a gap between what is being presented publicly and what is being examined privately, that gap eventually becomes visible. And once it becomes visible, it does not just affect one story, it starts affecting everything connected to it. Every interview, every past statement, every previous appearance begins to be re-evaluated through a different lens. People start asking not just what is being said now, but what has been said before, and whether those two things align. Now imagine how that plays out when you add another layer to the situation, because this is not the only legal pressure building at the same time. There is another case, separate but equally significant, where statements made under oath are now being compared with documented evidence. And if there is one thing that carries serious weight in situations like this, it is credibility under scrutiny. Let me ask you something, because this is where it becomes personal for the audience watching all of this unfold. When someone makes a statement publicly, you can choose to believe it or question it. But when that same statement is made in a legal setting, under oath, the expectations change completely. It is no longer about opinion. It is about accuracy, consistency, and truth that can be verified. So what happens when those statements are challenged? Not by speculation, but by documents, by records, by communication that suggests a different version of events. That is not just a contradiction, that is a situation that can redefine how credibility is perceived moving forward. And once credibility is questioned at that level, rebuilding it becomes exponentially more difficult. Now bring all of this back to the tour you are watching, because suddenly every moment feels more calculated, every appearance feels more purposeful, and every attempt to generate positive attention feels like it is operating under pressure. Not the kind of pressure that comes from public opinion alone, but the kind that comes from knowing that something bigger is approaching. And this is where the audience begins to split, because some people will continue to see these appearances at face value, while others will start connecting the timing, the behavior, and the context into a larger picture. That split in perception is important, because it shows how narratives evolve in real time, and how quickly public trust can shift when new information enters the frame. But here's the part that most people are only just starting to realize. If these legal challenges move forward the way some analysts expect them to, the consequences will not be limited to headlines or short-term criticism. They will shape long-term reputation, they will influence future opportunities, and they will determine how seriously future statements are taken. And that brings us back to the core question again, because it has not gone away, it has only become more important. Is this tour a comeback, or is it a response? Is it a display of strength, or is it an attempt to regain control at a moment when control is starting to slip? Because the answer to that question will define how everything that follows is interpreted. And if you thought what you have seen so far was intense, what comes next raises the stakes even higher, because this story is no longer just about public appearances, it is about what happens when those appearances collide with accountability. If the legal pressure explains the timing, the next question becomes even more uncomfortable. What is actually driving the behavior we are seeing play out in public? Because once you move past the headlines and start looking at patterns instead of moments, a very different picture begins to emerge, and it is one that is far less about isolated incidents and far more about consistent decision-making over time. Think about this carefully, because it is the kind of question most people do not ask out loud. What happens when someone is presented with clear evidence that their actions are causing damage, not just to their own reputation, but to something larger than themselves, and instead of adjusting, they push back? Not emotionally, not impulsively, but strategically, in a way that suggests control matters more than correction. Because according to the accounts now being discussed, that exact scenario has already happened. Evidence was reportedly gathered, not casually, but through structured analysis, designed to measure impact, to track consequences, and to present a clear picture of cause and effect. And when that information was placed on the table, calmly, logically, with the intention of addressing a problem, the response was not what many would expect. Now pause here, because this is where the story becomes more revealing than dramatic. Instead of acknowledging the issue or stepping back to reassess, the reaction appears to have shifted the focus entirely. From impact to personal feeling, from organizational concern to individual response. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, is what often defines how situations like this escalate instead of resolve. So ask yourself this: what does it say about leadership, about responsibility, when the priority becomes protecting personal perception rather than addressing documented consequences? Because that is the point where trust begins to erode, not just internally, but externally as well. And once that erosion starts, it rarely stays contained. Now add another layer to this, because it does not stop at disagreement or internal tension. There are claims that the situation moved beyond direct communication, into actions that were less visible but potentially more damaging. Conversations with stakeholders, interactions behind the scenes, attempts to influence perception without addressing the core issue. And if those claims hold weight, then the situation shifts from conflict to strategy. And this is where the audience needs to pay attention, because strategy leaves patterns, and patterns are what people eventually recognize. When similar behaviors appear across different situations, across different timelines, they stop looking like coincidences and start looking like a system. A way of operating that prioritizes certain outcomes regardless of context. So now the question becomes sharper. Are we looking at isolated missteps, or are we looking at a pattern that has simply become more visible because the stakes are higher? Because if it is the second, then what you are seeing in Australia is not an exception, it is a continuation. And here is where it becomes even more complex, because influence does not always operate in a straight line. There are moments, according to multiple accounts, where external dynamics appear to shape internal decisions, where reactions are not just personal but influenced by relationships, by expectations, by the need to maintain a certain narrative. And when that happens, accountability becomes harder to trace, because responsibility becomes shared, blurred, and sometimes redirected. Let me ask you something directly, because this is where the audience becomes part of the analysis. When you watch these appearances, when you see the interactions, when you hear the messaging, do they feel natural to you, or do they feel managed? Not polished, because public figures are always polished, but managed in a way that suggests each moment is serving a larger objective beyond what is immediately visible. Because that distinction matters. Natural moments build trust because they feel unfiltered, even when they are structured. Managed moments, on the other hand, create distance, because the audience senses the intention behind them. And once that distance is felt, it becomes increasingly difficult to reconnect in a meaningful way. Now connect this back to the earlier controversy, because the hospital visit was not just criticized for what happened, it was criticized for how it felt. The staging, the timing, the presence of cameras, all of it contributed to a perception that the moment was constructed rather than experienced. And when that perception aligns with broader patterns, it reinforces itself. And this is where comparisons begin to carry more weight than opinions. Because people are not just reacting to one event, they are comparing multiple approaches, multiple behaviors, and asking which one aligns more closely with what they expect from public service. When one approach feels consistent and the other feels conditional, the judgment becomes almost automatic. But here is the part that raises the stakes again, because perception is only one side of this story. The other side is consequence, and consequences do not always appear immediately. They build, they accumulate, and when they reach a certain point, they shift from being manageable to being defining. So what happens if the patterns being discussed are not only recognized by the public, but also examined in formal settings where evidence matters more than narrative? Because that is where things become difficult to navigate. You cannot adjust tone in a legal process. You cannot reframe intent through presentation. You cannot redirect focus away from documentation. And this is why the current moment feels like a turning point, not because of any single event, but because multiple threads are converging at the same time. Public scrutiny, legal pressure, shifting perception, all moving in parallel, all influencing how the story is being understood. Now here is the question that sits at the center of all of this, and it is one that does not have an easy answer. Is this a situation where adaptation is still possible, where course correction can still change the outcome, or has the pattern reached a point where it defines the trajectory moving forward? Because if adaptation is still possible, then what you are seeing now is a critical moment, a chance to shift direction before consequences become fixed. But if the pattern is already established, then what you are watching is not a transition, it is a continuation towards something that may already be set in motion. And if you think this is where the story reaches its peak, then the next development changes the scale entirely, because what is coming next is not just about behavior or perception, it is about what happens when credibility itself is tested in a way that cannot be managed or reframed. If everything we have just unpacked feels intense, the next layer takes this story out of the realm of perception entirely and places it somewhere far less flexible, because now we are no longer dealing with interpretation or intent, we are dealing with something that has a fixed standard, credibility under oath. And here's the question you need to hold on to as we move forward, because it changes how you view everything that comes next. What happens when a public narrative is no longer judged by how convincing it sounds, but by whether it can withstand direct comparison with documented evidence? Because that is a completely different test, and not everyone passes it. There is another case running parallel to everything we have discussed so far, and unlike the broader reputational concerns, this one is precise, contained, and very difficult to manage through presentation alone. It involves statements that were made formally, clearly, and with the understanding that they would be examined, challenged, and verified. And that changes the stakes immediately, because once something is placed into that environment, it cannot be adjusted afterward without consequences. Now think about this carefully, because this is where the tension becomes very real. A claim is made, firm and direct, suggesting that a particular relationship or interaction did not exist in any meaningful way. It is not vague, it is not open to interpretation, it is stated with certainty. And for a moment, that certainty holds, because without contradiction, any statement can appear stable. But then something happens that shifts the entire balance. Evidence surfaces, not speculative, not indirect, but concrete enough to raise serious questions about that original claim. Communication records, exchanges, patterns of contact that suggest a level of familiarity that does not align with what was initially presented. And once that contradiction enters the picture, the situation changes completely. Let me ask you this, because this is where the audience needs to engage directly with the implications. When two versions of a story exist, one stated under oath and one supported by documentation, which one carries more weight? Because in everyday conversation, people can choose what to believe, but in a legal context, that choice is removed. The outcome is determined by consistency, by proof, and by whether the narrative holds up under scrutiny. And this is why moments like this are so significant, because they do not just affect a single case, they ripple outward into every other aspect of public perception. If credibility is questioned in one setting, it does not stay contained there. It influences how future statements are received, how past statements are reevaluated, and how trust is assigned moving forward. Now connect this back to everything we have been discussing, because suddenly the Australian tour feels different again. It is no longer just about image repair or narrative control, it starts to feel like it is happening alongside a credibility test that cannot be influenced by appearances. And that creates a kind of tension that is very difficult to hide, because one side is visible and flexible, while the other is fixed and unforgiving. And here is where the comparison becomes unavoidable, because history has shown us what happens when individuals operate within a closed environment where their own version of events is rarely challenged. Over time, that environment can create a sense of certainty that does not always align with external reality. And when those two worlds collide, the outcome is rarely comfortable. So ask yourself this: is what we are seeing now the result of that kind of environment? A situation where statements are made with confidence because they have not been consistently tested, only to encounter resistance when they finally are? Because if that is the case, then what you are witnessing is not just a series of controversies, it is a structural issue that affects how decisions are made and how risks are evaluated. Now consider the potential consequences, because they extend far beyond a single ruling or a single headline. If a judgment ultimately questions the reliability of sworn statements, that becomes a permanent marker. It is not something that can be easily reframed or softened over time. It attaches itself to reputation in a way that influences everything that follows. And this is why the current moment feels so critical, because multiple lines of pressure are converging at once. Public perception is shifting, legal challenges are advancing, and credibility is being tested in environments that do not respond to narrative control. When all of those factors align, the margin for error becomes extremely small. But here's the part that adds another layer of complexity, because while all of this is unfolding, there is still an active effort to maintain visibility, to continue public engagements, to project normalcy. And that creates a contrast that audiences are starting to notice. On one side, there is a polished, controlled presentation. On the other, there are unresolved issues that carry significant weight. Let me bring you into this again with a direct question, because this is where interpretation becomes personal. When you see that contrast, when you watch public appearances happening alongside serious legal scrutiny, does it increase your confidence in the narrative, or does it make you question it more? Because that reaction, multiplied across an audience, is what ultimately shapes broader perception. And perception, at this level, is not just about popularity. It influences opportunities, partnerships, and the willingness of institutions to engage or distance themselves. When credibility becomes uncertain, even temporarily, it introduces risk, and risk is something organizations tend to avoid rather than absorb. Now imagine how that plays out over time, because this is not a single moment, it is a sequence. Each development builds on the previous one, each outcome influences the next, and gradually a trajectory forms. And once that trajectory becomes clear, changing it requires more than visibility. It requires a fundamental shift that addresses the underlying issues rather than the surface presentation. So here we are, at a point where the story is no longer driven by isolated events, but by how those events connect. A hospital visit that raised questions, a legal case that introduced pressure, a credibility challenge that cannot be easily managed, all converging into a single narrative that is still unfolding. And the question that now becomes unavoidable is this: what happens next if these pressures do not ease, but instead intensify? Because if you thought the situation was already complex, the next phase moves beyond individual actions and into something even broader, where institutions, public response, and long-term consequences begin to intersect in ways that are far more difficult to predict. If everything we have explored so far feels like pressure building from multiple directions, the final piece of the story is where those pressures begin to collide with something even bigger: institutional response. And here's the question you should be asking yourself right now, because it determines how this entire situation evolves from this point forward. What happens when public controversy, legal scrutiny, and institutional patience all reach their limit at the same time? Because institutions do not react the way individuals do. They move slower, they absorb more, and they often remain silent far longer than the public expects. But when they do act, they act in ways that are calculated, measured, and designed to protect something much larger than a single person or a single narrative. And that is exactly why the next phase of the story matters more than anything we have discussed so far. Now think about this carefully, because this is where the scale expands beyond one tour, one lawsuit, or one controversy. There is growing frustration among audiences, not just casual viewers, but long-time observers who understand how these systems operate. The question of titles, the question of association, the question of whether someone can continue to benefit from an institution while simultaneously distancing themselves from it. All of these questions are becoming louder, more direct, and harder to ignore. So let me ask you this: how long can that tension exist before a decision is forced? Because there is a difference between tolerance and endorsement, and institutions are very careful about where they draw that line. If public sentiment continues to shift in one direction, and if legal outcomes begin to reinforce that shift, the space for neutrality starts to shrink. And this is where another layer enters the story, one that has been building quietly in the background but carries significant weight. The future of influence, the transfer of authority, and the individuals who will ultimately shape how the institution responds moving forward. Because decisions like these are not always made in isolation, they are influenced by long-term strategy, by legacy, and by the need to maintain stability over time. Now consider how that interacts with everything else we have discussed, because if the current trajectory continues, the conversation will no longer be about individual actions alone. It will be about whether those actions align with the expectations placed on anyone associated with that institution. And if they do not, then the question becomes unavoidable. What happens to that association? And here is where the stakes become even clearer, because this is not just about titles or public appearances. It is about access, about credibility, about whether future opportunities remain open or begin to close. When perception shifts at a large enough scale, It influences decisions that are rarely announced directly but are felt through absence, through distance, through a gradual withdrawal of support. Now pause and think about the trajectory we have followed from the beginning. A hospital visit that raised ethical questions, a tour that feels more reactive than celebratory, legal challenges that introduce serious risk, credibility being tested in formal settings, and now the possibility of institutional response. This is not a collection of separate events, it is a chain, and each link strengthens the next. So the question becomes sharper than ever. Is this a moment that can still be redirected, or is it the beginning of a long-term shift that will redefine how this story is understood in the future? Because if it is the second, then what you are watching right now is not just a chapter, it is a turning point. And here is something most people are only beginning to realize. Reputation does not collapse all at once. It changes gradually, through accumulation, through repeated moments that alter perception bit by bit. And by the time the shift becomes obvious, it has often already happened. That is why moments like this matter so much, because they are where trajectories either stabilize or accelerate. Let me bring you into this one more time, because your perspective is part of this story as well. When you look at everything we have covered, from the early optics to the deeper legal implications, do you see a situation that is being managed effectively, or do you see one that is becoming increasingly difficult to control? Because that distinction is what will define how the next phase unfolds. And if you thought the pressure was already significant, consider what happens if upcoming outcomes do not align with the narrative being presented publicly. Because at that point, the gap between perception and reality becomes impossible to maintain, and when that gap closes, it does so quickly. Now here is the final layer, the one that ties everything together. This is no longer just about one couple, one tour, or one controversy. It is about how modern public figures operate within systems that have long-standing expectations, and what happens when those expectations are challenged repeatedly in a very visible way. It is about the balance between personal branding and institutional responsibility, and what happens when that balance begins to break. And that is why this story matters beyond the immediate headlines, because it reflects a broader shift in how audiences evaluate authenticity, accountability, and alignment. People are no longer reacting only to what they are shown, they are analyzing how it fits into a larger pattern, and that level of awareness changes everything. So as this continues to unfold, the only question that really matters is this: what comes next when all of these forces finally meet? Because whether the outcome is resolution, escalation, or something in between, it will not happen quietly, and it will not go unnoticed. If you have made it this far, I want to hear your perspective, not just your reaction but your analysis. Do you think this situation can still be turned around, or do you believe we are already watching the consequences play out in real time? Drop your thoughts below, because this is one of those moments where the audience sees things the headlines often miss. And if you want more breakdowns like this,